the day tea arrived in Britain. And nobody knew how to brew it was a foggy morning in London, sometime in the mid-1600s, the kind of morning where the damp air clung to wool coats, and the sound of carriage wheels echoed faintly through cobbled streets. Somewhere near the docks, a merchant opened a crate, small, wooden, and faintly aromatic. Inside were curled dried leaves smelling faintly of hay, citrus, and something else. Something unfamiliar. This was tea, and nobody had the faintest idea what to do with it. The leaves had arrived via Portuguese and Dutch traders who had picked up the habit from China and Japan. In those cultures, tea was already a refined ritual steeped with precision, sipped with reverence, but in Britain, it was still a mystery. The first written mention of tea in England appeared in 1658, in a London newspaper advertising China drink, called cha. It was sold in apothecaries, not cafes. It was considered medicinal, not social. At first, only the wealthy could afford it. Tea was expensive, more than coffee, more than chocolate. It was locked away in ornate tea caddies, guarded by servants who held the keys. A hostess might serve it to guests in tiny cups, with great ceremony, and then immediately hide the rest. It was not uncommon for tea to be reused leaves steeped once, dried, and steeped again. Waste not, want not, but even among the elite, confusion reigned. Recipes varied wildly. Some boiled the leaves like vegetables. Others chewed them directly, hoping for a medicinal effect. One enthusiastic gentleman reportedly added salt and pepper, convinced it was a kind of exotic soup base. The idea of steeping it gently in hot water hadn't quite caught on. One pamphlet from 1675 suggested boiling the leaves for no less than 20 minutes, resulting in a brew so bitter it could strip paint. Another advised mixing tea with ale to fortify the spirit, which likely did more to confuse the palate than invigorate the soul. The idea of adding milk was considered scandalous at first. Why dilute such a rare and precious liquid? Gradually, though, the British began to settle into a rhythm. Tea houses opened in London, modeled after coffee houses but with a quieter, more refined atmosphere. Men gathered to discuss politics, literature, and trade over cups of increasingly well-brewed tea. Women, initially excluded from coffee houses, found their own spaces to sip and socialize. Tea became a symbol of civility, of calm, of domestic grace. By the early 1700s, tea was no longer just a curiosity, it was a craze. Imports soared, prices dropped. The East India Company began shipping it in bulk, and soon, even middle-class households had their own tea set. The ritual of afternoon tea began to take shape, not yet the full-blown Victorian affair with scones and cucumber sandwiches, but a quiet pause in the day, a moment to sit, sip, and reflect. Still, the brewing process remained inconsistent. Without standardized instructions, people relied on word of mouth. Some steeped for 5 minutes, others for 20. Water temperature varied wildly. One pamphlet from 1721 advised boiling the water until it sings, a poetic but imprecise guideline. Another suggested adding a pinch of salt to awaken the leaves, which likely did more harm than good. It wasn't until the late 18th century that tea brewing began to stabilize. Porcelain teapots became common. Strainers were invented. Milk and sugar became standard additions, softening the bitterness and adding a touch of indulgence. The British palate had found its comfort zone. And yet, even as tea became ubiquitous, its origins remained exotic. The idea that these curled leaves had traveled thousands of miles from Chinese hillsides to British hearths added a touch of mystery to every cup. It was a drink that connected empires, sparked trade wars, and shaped entire economies. But in the quiet kitchens of Britain, it was simply tea. By the early 1800s, tea had become so ingrained in British life that it began to influence work culture. Factory owners noticed that workers who paused for tea were more alert, less irritable, and somewhat miraculously more productive. The tea break was born not as a formal policy, but as a quiet concession. A kettle in the corner, a few minutes of calm, a biscuit, if you were lucky. But before we get to the Industrial Revolution, let's linger a little longer in the drawing rooms of Georgian England. Imagine yourself in a modest London home in 1783. The fire crackles, a servant brings in a china, a small pot, a bowl of sugar. The tea has been steeped for exactly 7 minutes, as per the latest advice from Lady Whistledown's pamphlet. You lift the cup. It's warm, earthy, slightly bitter, and somehow comforting. The British may not have known how to brew tea when it first arrived, but they learned, slowly, awkwardly, and with no shortage of experimentation. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for one of the most enduring rituals in modern life, the tea break. And so, the humble leaf once chewed, boiled, and missed its place in British hearts and kettles. It would go on to shape not just social customs, but work schedules, wartime morale, and even biscuit design. But those stories are for later chapters. For now, let the kettle whistle softly in your imagination. Let the steam rise, let the tea steep, and let the quiet comfort of a well-brewed cup carry you gently toward sleep. Chapter 2. When factory workers were given tea, productivity magically rose. The year was 1842. The air inside the textile mill was thick with lint and steam. Machines clattered, belts whirred, and the floor trembled beneath the rhythmic stomp of iron looms. Outside, the sky was grey. Inside, the workers were greyer, still faces pale from long hours, hands calloused from endless spinning, and minds dulled by repetition. And then, someone had an idea. It wasn't a grand idea. It wasn't written in a memo or announced with fanfare. It was simply this: let's give them tea. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into a land of factories, furnaces, and fatigue. Workers toiled for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. Breaks were rare, meals were rushed, and morale was, well, let's just say it was not high. Managers noticed that by mid-afternoon, productivity dipped, tempers flared, mistakes multiplied. Something had to be done. Enter the kettle. In a Lancashire textile mill, a foreman named Mr. Hargreaves, who was known for his unusually generous moustache and unusually short temper, decided to allow a 5-minute pause at 3 p.m. A kettle was placed near the back wall beside a stack of bobbins. Workers could bring their own cups, fill them with hot water, and steep whatever leaves they could afford. Sometimes it was tea, sometimes it was mint. Sometimes it was just hot water and hope. The results were immediate. Workers returned to their stations calmer, more focused, and somehow faster. The looms clattered with renewed energy. The foreman's mustache twitched with approval. And thus, the tea break was born. At first it was informal, a quiet understanding. No one rang a bell or blew a whistle. But over time the ritual grew. Kettles became standard equipment. Employers began supplying tea leaves. Some even added biscuits, plain, dry, and slightly disappointing, but biscuits nonetheless. In Yorkshire, a mill owner named Mrs. Penelope Griggs took things further. She installed a tea corner in her factory, complete with benches, a samovar, and a chalkboard, listing the day's brew. Monday was black tea. Tuesday was Earl Grey. Wednesday was whatever's left. Workers adored her. Productivity soared, and her factory became known as the one with the good tea. But not everyone was convinced. Some managers feared that tea breaks would lead to laziness. One pamphlet from 1856 warned that excessive steeping may result in moral decline. Another claimed that tea made workers too contemplative, which was apparently a problem. Still, the evidence was hard to ignore. Tea breaks improved output. They reduced accidents, and they made the factory floor just a little less grim. That by the 1860s, tea breaks had spread across industries. Shipbuilders paused to sip by the docks. Miners brewed underground, using tin kettles and candle flames. Even chimney sweeps covered in soot and sarcasm found time for a cuppa between flues. The ritual varied by region. In Cornwall, tea was served with clotted cream and stern warnings not to spill. In Birmingham, it was accompanied by gossip and the occasional harmonica solo. In Glasgow, it was strong enough to strip paint and served with a side of existential dread. But no matter the location, the effect was the same. Tea brought people together. It softened the edges of hard labor. It created moments of quiet in the chaos, and it gave workers something to look forward to besides payday and the occasional fire drill. In some factories, tea breaks became so beloved that workers began timing their tasks around them. "I'll finish this spool before the kettle whistles" became a common refrain. Supervisors learned to schedule meetings after tea, never before, and disputes were often settled over a shared potby, because it's hard to argue while dunking a biscuit. The government took notice. In 1871, a parliamentary report on labor conditions included a section titled "On the Merits of Midday Infusions." It praised tea breaks as a modest but meaningful improvement to the industrial temperament. One MP even proposed a national tea break hour, though it was ultimately rejected in favor of more pressing matters like chimney taxes and the proper length of waistcoats. Still, the idea persisted. Schools began offering tea to teachers. Post offices installed kettles. Even prisons experimented with tea breaks, though the biscuits were often confiscated for being too cheerful. By the turn of the century, tea breaks were no longer a novelty. They were a norm. Factories built dedicated tea rooms. Employers hired tea ladies, whose sole job was to brew, pour, and occasionally listen to complaints about management. These tea ladies became beloved figures, part barista, part therapist, part biscuit distributor. One such tea lady, Mrs. Doris Featherstone of Manchester, was known for her ability to remember every worker's preferred brew. 2 sugars, no milk, and a dash of melancholy for Mr. Thompson, she'd say, handing over a steaming cup. Her trolley was decorated with lace, her kettle polished to a shine, and her presence considered more effective than any HR department. Tea breaks also began to influence architecture. Factory designers included tea nooks and blueprints. Offices added break rooms with kettles, cups, and motivational posters that read, "Keep calm and steep on." The tea break had become a cultural institution. And yet, despite its ubiquity, the tea break remained humble. It was never flashy, never loud, just a quiet pause, a moment to breathe, to sip, to reflect, to complain about the foreman's new hat, to share a biscuit, to feel, if only briefly, human. Today, the legacy of those early factory tea breaks lives on. In offices, in schools, in homes, the kettle whistles, the cup warms your hands, and for a few minutes the world slows down. So next time you take a tea break, Remember Mr. Hargreaves and his mustache. Remember Mrs. Griggs and her chalkboard. Remember the miners, the sweeps, the harmonica players, and know that your quiet moment is part of a long, strange, comforting tradition. And now, as the steam rises and the biscuits crumble, let the gentle rhythm of history lull you toward sleep. The machines may have stopped, the looms may be silent, but the kettle still sings Sichipi 2-3. The tea trolley that silenced a room full of clerks. It was precisely 3 p.m. in a government office in London, circa 1923. The room was filled with the sounds of rustling papers, ticking clocks, and the occasional sigh of a man who had just realized he'd misfiled something 3 hours ago. The clerks sat in rose-gray suits, gray faces, gray thoughts, stamping, and wondering if life held anything more than carbon copies and ink smudges. And then, it happened. A distant squeak, a gentle rattle, a faint clink of porcelain. Heads turned, pens paused, the room fell silent. The tea trolley had arrived. It was pushed by Miss Agnes Butterfield, a woman of indeterminate age and infinite patience. Her trolley was a marvel of engineering to shelves, 1 kettle, 6 cups, a sugar bowl, and a tin of biscuits that may or may not have been from last week. She moved with quiet authority, her sensible shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. The clerks watched her approach as if she were royalty. She nodded at Mr. Pemberton, who always took his tea black. She handed a cup to Miss Eliza Finch, who preferred hers with milk and exactly 1 sugar cube. She poured for Mr. Griggs, who never said thank you but always tipped his saucer to avoid spills. It was a ritual, a dance, a moment of grace in an otherwise graceless day. The tea trolley was more than a beverage delivery system. It was a symbol, a beacon, a reminder that even in the most bureaucratic corners of the empire, humanity could still be brewed. Its origins were humble. In the early 20th century, offices began experimenting with mobile tea service as a way to boost morale. The idea was simple. Instead of forcing workers to queue at a communal kettle, bring the tea to them. It saved time, it reduced clutter, and it introduced a new character into the workplace, the tea lady. Tea ladies were often older women, retired from other professions or simply seeking a quiet job with predictable hours. They were chosen not just for their brewing skills, but for their discretion, their memory, and their ability to navigate office politics with the grace of a diplomat. They knew who liked Earl Grey and who preferred Darjeeling. They knew who was feuding with whom, and which biscuit could mend a broken friendship. Miss Butterfield was one such legend. She had worked in the Ministry of Paperwork for 17 years, and her trolley was as much a fixture as the filing cabinets. She wore a brooch shaped like a teacup. She hummed softly as she poured, and she had a sixth sense for when someone needed a second cup. One day, Mr. Pemberton was particularly glum. His ink bottle had exploded, his typewriter had jammed, and he'd just received a memo about a memo he'd forgotten to send. Miss Butterfield approached quietly, poured his tea, and added a biscuit he hadn't asked for. It was a custard cream, his favorite. He looked up, nodded once, and returned, to work with slightly less despair. The trolley itself was a masterpiece. Polished wood, brass wheels, and a faint scent of bergamot. It carried not just tea but comfort, familiarity, a sense of order in a world of chaos. When it rolled through the office, time slowed, conversations paused. Even the clocks seemed to tick more gently. In some offices, the arrival of the tea trolley was accompanied by a bell. In others, it was announced by the soft clatter of cups. But in the Ministry of Paperwork, it was simply known at 3 p.m. The trolley would appear, and for 5 minutes the office would become a sanctuary. The tea break was not just about tea. It was about connection. Clerks who hadn't spoken all day would exchange nods. A quiet joke might be shared. A sigh might be answered with a sympathetic smile. It was a moment of shared humanity, wrapped in steam and sugar. Of course, not everyone appreciated the ritual. Mr. Blenkinsop, the assistant to the assistant undersecretary, once complained that the tea trolley disrupted workflow. He proposed replacing it with a vending machine. The idea was met with silence, followed by a collective shuffling of papers that sounded suspiciously like disapproval. The vending machine was never installed. Mr. Blenkinsop was later transferred to the Department of Staplers. Tea trolleys also had their quirks. Sometimes the kettle would sputter. Sometimes the biscuits would crumble prematurely. Once, a wheel came loose and the trolley veered into a stack of memos, causing a minor avalanche. But these mishaps were part of the charm. They reminded everyone that perfection was overrated, and that a slightly soggy biscuit could still brighten a day. In larger offices, tea ladies formed unions. They shared recipes, trolley maintenance tips, and stories of difficult customers. One newsletter, the Steeper's Digest, featured articles like how to handle a passive-aggressive Earl Grey drinker and the art of biscuit diplomacy. It was a thriving subculture, quietly keeping the workforce caffeinated and civil. By the 1950s, tea trolleys had become standard in British offices. They appeared in government buildings, insurance firms, publishing houses, and even police stations. Some were decorated with lace. Others had tiny radios playing classical music. A few ambitious tea ladies added lemon slices and cinnamon sticks, though this was considered avant-garde. The ritual endured for decades, even as computers replaced typewriters and memos became emails. The tea trolley remained. It adapted, it evolved, but it never lost its soul. And then, slowly it began to fade. Budget cuts, modernization, the rise of self-service kitchens. The tea lady became a rarity. The trolley was retired, and offices grew quieter, not in a peaceful way, but in a lonely way. People made their own tea alone, in microwaves. Biscuits came from vending machines. Conversations dwindled. The ritual was lost, but not entirely. In some corners of Britain, the tea trolley survives in small law firms, in rural council offices, in nostalgic startups run by sentimental founders. It rolls quietly, carrying cups, comfort, and the memory of a gentler time. So if you ever find yourself in an office at 3 p.m., and you hear a faint squeak, a gentle clink, and the soft hum of a woman who knows your biscuit preference, pause, look up, smile. The tea trolley has returned. And as the steam rises and the room falls silent, let yourself drift. Let the warmth of the cup soothe your thoughts. Let the rhythm of the trolley lull you, and let the quiet dignity of Miss Butterfield guide you gently towards sleep. Chapter 4. The biscuit that sparked a decade-long debate began, as many great British controversies do, with a biscuit. The year was 1937, the place a modest office in Sheffield, the time 3 p.m. tea break. The trolley had arrived, the kettle had whistled, and the cups had been poured. But then, Miss Edith Cartwright reached for the last digestive biscuit, and Mr. Harold Smythe reached for it at the exact same moment. Their hands collided, their eyes met, and thus began the great biscuit debate. To the untrained eye, a digestive biscuit is a humble thing. Round, beige, slightly crumbly. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't boast. It simply exists quietly, reliably, and with just enough sweetness to make you feel mildly optimistic about life. But in Britain, the digestive is more than a snack. It's a symbol, a staple, a cultural cornerstone. And in the 1930s, it was at the center of a biscuit-based rivalry that would stretch across offices, counties, and generations. Mr. Smythe, a man of rigid habits and suspicious eyebrows, believed the digestive was the superior tea companion. It absorbs just the right amount of liquid, he argued. Not too soggy, not too dry. It's the Goldilocks of biscuits. Miss Cartwright, a woman of quiet conviction and an impressive collection of brooches, disagreed. She championed the rich tea biscuit, thinner, crisper, and, in her words, less presumptuous. She claimed it dunked with dignity, never crumbled prematurely, and paired better with lemon-infused brews. Their disagreement was polite at first. A raised eyebrow here, a passive-aggressive biscuit placement there. But soon others joined the fray. The office divided into factions. Digestive loyalists sat on one side of the break room, rich tea enthusiasts sat on the other. The tea lady, caught in the middle, began carrying 2 tins and refused to take sides. The debate spread. Letters were written, polls were conducted. One particularly passionate clerk created a spreadsheet comparing dunk times, crumble rates, and flavor retention. It was presented at the annual office retreat, where it was met with applause, confusion, and a heated argument about whether chocolate-covered digestives should count. Outside the office, the biscuit war gained traction. Newspapers ran columns titled The Dunking Divide and Britain's Crumbiest Conflict. Biscuit manufacturers saw an opportunity and began marketing their products with slogans like digestives, the biscuit of the people, and rich tea, elegance in every bite. Even Parliament got involved. In 1942, during a lull in wartime debates, one MP jokingly proposed a National Biscuit Standardization Act. It was never passed, but it sparked a lively discussion in the House of Commons tea room, where leaves were revealed and biscuits were dunked with theatrical flair. Meanwhile, in offices across the country, the debate continued. New contenders emerged. Hobnobs with their Otti bravado, bourbon creams with their chocolate swagger, custard creams, beloved by romantics and sugar enthusiasts alike. Each had its champions, each had its critics, but none stirred the passions, quite like the digestive and the rich tea. In one London firm, a manager attempted to resolve the issue by instituting biscuit rotation week. Each day featured a different biscuit. Monday was digestives, Tuesday was rich tea, Wednesday was shortbread, Thursday was ginger nuts, Friday was dealer's choice. The system worked for a while until someone brought in Jaffa cakes and sparked a new debate, biscuit or cake. The biscuit wars were not without casualties. Friendships were strained. Meetings were delayed. One office newsletter was suspended after publishing a controversial ranking that placed fig rolls above custard creams. The editor was reassigned to the Department of Filing, where he spent the rest of his career alphabetizing invoices and quietly eating digestives. And yet, for all the drama, the biscuit debate had a strangely soothing effect. It gave people something to discuss beyond memos and margins. It added flavor to otherwise bland afternoons. It created rituals, traditions, and inside jokes. It turned tea breaks into tiny adventures. In some offices, biscuit clubs were formed. Members met weekly to sample new varieties, rate them on texture, taste, and dunkability, and argue passionately about whether pink wafers were a crime against humanity. Minutes were taken, votes were cast, biscuits were consumed with reverence. One club, the Society for the Preservation of the Proper Dunk, published a guidebook titled Crumbs of Wisdom. It included tips like always dunk with confidence, never dunk more than twice, and respect the crumble. It became a cult classic among tea enthusiasts and was later adapted into a radio segment that aired every Thursday at 3:15 p.m. By the 1960s, the biscuit debate had mellowed. Offices began offering variety trays. Tea ladies carried laminated menus. Dunking etiquette was taught to interns. The digestive and the rich tea found a kind of peaceful coexistence, each respected, each beloved, each quietly judging the other. Today, the debate lives on in quieter forms. In break rooms, in kitchens, in nostalgic conversations, people still have their favorites. They still defend them with gentle passion. And they still believe, deep down, that their biscuit of choice says something profound about their character. So, next time you reach for a biscuit during your tea break, pause, consider its history, its texture, its place in the great British crumbscape, and remember that behind every dunk is a story, a rivalry, a moment of quiet rebellion. And as the biscuit softens in your cup, let your thoughts soften too. Let the steam rise, let the crumbs fall, let the gentle absurdity of it all lull you towards sleep, because in the end, whether you choose a digestive, a rich tea, or something entirely roguelike, a Garibaldi, it's all just part of the ritual. The pause, the comfort, the quiet joy of tea and biscuits. Chapter 5. How Tea Became a Wartime Weapon of Morality. Was 1940. The skies over London were heavy with smoke and sirens. The streets were quiet, save for the distant hum of aircraft and the occasional bark of a dog who didn't care for air raids. In kitchens, bunkers, and mobile canteens, kettles hissed, cups clinked, and tea, humble, hot and slightly oversteeped, was served like a lifeline. Britain was at war. The Blitz had begun, and amid the chaos, tea became more than a beverage. It became a balm, a ritual, a weapon of morale. The Ministry of Food, never one to overlook the emotional power of carbohydrates and caffeine, declared tea an essential wartime supply. Rationing was strict. Sugar, meat, even eggs were limited, but tea was protected. It was considered vital to national stability. A cup of tea, they argued, could soothe nerves, lift spirits, and make even the most dreadful news slightly more digestible. And so, tea was shipped, stored, and served with military precision. In bomb shelters, volunteers brewed tea over portable stoves. The cups were mismatched. The milk was powdered. The sugar was scarce, but the warmth was real. People huddled together, sipping slowly, listening to the radio, and waiting for the alclea. Children were given weak tea with extra milk. Elderly ladies stirred their cups with quiet dignity, and somewhere in the corner, a man named Arthur insisted on discussing cricket scores, as if nothing were happening overhead. Mobile tea vans became a common sight, painted in cheerful colors and staffed by cheerful women. These vans roamed the streets, delivering tea to rescue workers, firemen, and anyone who looked like they'd had a rough morning, which, in wartime Britain, was everyone. The vans carried kettles, cups, and biscuits that had seen better days. They also carried hope. One such van, nicknamed the Steaming Sentinel, was operated by Mrs. Maud Pickering, a retired schoolteacher with a talent for brewing and a voice like warm velvet. She knew every street, every shortcut, and every fireman's preferred biscuit. She once served tea to an entire platoon while reciting poetry about hedgehogs. They said it was the most comforting moment of the entire campaign. Tea was also served on the front lines. Soldiers received ration packs with tea leaves, condensed milk, and tiny stoves. In trenches, on ships, in tents, tea was brewed in tin mugs and sipped with quiet reverence. It was a taste of home, a reminder of normalcy, a brief escape from mud, noise, and uncertainty. One soldier wrote in his diary, "The tea is strong, bitter, and slightly metallic. It tastes like victory." In factories, tea breaks became sacred. Women working long shifts in munitions plants paused to sip and chat. The tea was often lukewarm, the cups were chipped, but the ritual mattered. It was a moment to breathe, to laugh, to complain about the foreman's new haircut. It was a reminder that life continued, even in wartime. The government encouraged tea consumption with posters and slogans. "Tea revives you," declared one. "Keep calm and put the kettle on," said another. There were radio segments about proper steeping techniques, pamphlets on biscuit conservation. Even Winston Churchill weighed in, declaring tea more important than ammunition in terms of morale. Of course, not all tea was created equal. Rationing meant that quality varied. Some brews were weak, others were strong enough to remove wallpaper. People adapted. They reused leaves. They experimented with chicory. They added salt, lemon, or whatever was available. One enterprising woman in Kent created a tea substitute using dried beetroot and optimism. It was not a success. Still, the ritual endured. Tea was served at funerals, weddings, and impromptu sing-alongs. It was brewed in blackout conditions, in rain, in rubble. It was carried in thermoses, flasks, and hollowed-out books. It was shared with strangers, offered to the wounded, and used to bribe bureaucrats. In one memorable incident, a group of evacuees arrived at a countryside manor and were greeted not with speeches, but with tea. The cups were floral, the biscuits were stale. The welcome was perfect. One child reportedly said, "I don't know where we are, but they have tea, so it must be safe." Tea also played a role in espionage. Agents used tea codes to sugars, meant all clear. No milk meant abort mission. Earl Grey meant the target is wearing a hat. These codes were not officially sanctioned, but they added a layer of British charm to international intrigue on hospitals. Nurses served tea to patients with a bedside manner that bordered on saintly. The tea was often more comforting than the medicine. It was warm, familiar, and served with a smile that said, "You're still here. You're still you." By the end of the war, tea had become a symbol of resilience. It had seen Britain through bombings, blackouts, and bureaucratic blunders. It had comforted the grieving, revived the weary, and united the divided. It had been served in porcelain, tin and paper. It had been sipped in silence and slurped in celebration. And when victory was declared, when the streets filled with laughter and music, when strangers hugged and danced and cried, tea was there, in cups raised high, in kettles whistling, in toasts made with nothing stronger than a good brew. Today, the wartime tea ritual lives on in memory, in stories, in quiet moments. It's in the way we reach for the kettle during bad news, in the way we offer a cup to someone who's had a rough day, in the way we pause, sip, and remember that comfort can be brewed. So as you sit quietly, listening to the soft hiss of an imaginary kettle, let the warmth of history wrap around you. Let the steam rise, let the sirens fade, let the tea do what it has always done: revive, restore, and gently lull. Because in the darkest hours, Britain didn't just fight with courage, it fought with cups. Chapter 6. The radio show that paused for tea. Tea was 4 p.m. on a Thursday in 1951. The wireless crackled softly in the corner of a modest living room. A cat snored on the windowsill, a kettle whistled in the kitchen, and across Britain, thousands of listeners leaned in, waiting for the next episode of the afternoon hour radio show, so beloved, so gently paced, and so thoroughly British that it paused halfway through. For tea. Not a commercial break, not a dramatic cliffhanger, just a quiet moment where the host, Mr. Reginald Tuppence, would say, "And now, dear listeners, let us take a brief pause." The kettle calls. What followed was 3 minutes of ambient clinking, soft pouring, and the faint sound of a spoon stirring sugar. It was, by all accounts, the most soothing moment in British broadcasting history. The show itself was a blend of storytelling, interviews, and gentle trivia. Topics ranged from the history of umbrella handles to why garden gnomes are always smiling. Mr. Tuppence spoke in a voice that sounded like tweed warm, slightly scratchy and deeply comforting. He never rushed. He never raised his voice. He once spent an entire episode describing the evolution of sock elastic, but it was the tea pause that made the show iconic. Listeners adored it. They timed their own tea breaks to match. Offices adjusted schedules. Schools allowed teachers to tune in. One factory in Leeds installed a loudspeaker so workers could hear the kettle segment while sipping from enamel mugs. It became a national ritual. Pukulum pot PM. Radio on, kettle on, world off. The BBC, initially skeptical, embraced the phenomenon. They added ambient sound effects, gentle rain, distant birds, the occasional sheep. They experimented with different pouring styles. One sound engineer became famous for his ability to capture the perfect milk swirl. He was later knighted for services to tranquility. Mr. Tuppence took his role seriously. He studied tea history. He consulted with tea ladies. He once traveled to Darjeeling to understand the emotional nuances of first flush leaves. He returned with a suitcase full of samples and a story about a goat who preferred oolong. Each episode's tea pause was slightly different. Sometimes he described the brewing process. Sometimes he recited poetry. Sometimes he simply let the silence speak. One memorable pause featured the sound of a biscuit being gently broken in half. Listeners wept. The show's popularity grew. Fan clubs formed. Tea shops played episodes on loop. A small village in Devon renamed its main street Tuppence Lane and held an annual tea festival featuring dramatic readings of kettle instructions. But not everyone was pleased. One critic from the Times called the show an affront to urgency. Another claimed it encouraged dangerous levels of relaxation. A third argued that the biscuit segment was too emotionally manipulative. Mr. Tuppence responded by sending each critic a handwritten note and a tin of shortbread. 2 of them recanted. The third retired to Cornwall and opened a tea room. The show also inspired imitators. Tea Time Tales, The Biscuit Hour, and Kettle Confidential all tried to replicate the magic. Some succeeded, others failed. One show, Tea and Tragedy, attempted to combine tea breaks with dramatic reenactments of historical disasters. It was quietly discontinued after an episode titled The Sinking of the Biscuit Tin. Meanwhile, the afternoon hour continued its gentle reign. Listeners wrote in with their own tea stories. One woman described how the show helped her recover from heartbreak. A retired postman said it cured his insomnia. A child claimed it taught him patience, though he still ate the biscuit before the pause ended. Mr. Tuppence read these letters aloud, slowly, with great care. He never mocked. He never rushed. He once spent 7 minutes describing a listener's favorite mug, a chipped ceramic cup with a faded picture of a hedgehog wearing a monocle. It was, he said, a vessel of quiet dignity. The show also featured occasional guests, a biscuit historian, a spoon designer, a man who claimed to have invented the perfect dunking angle. Each was treated with respect, given time to speak, and offered tea live on air. The clinking of cups became a signature sound. The phrase, milk first or last, sparked debates that lasted for weeks. In 1957, the show reached its peak. Over 3 million listeners tuned in weekly. Tea sales rose. Biscuit manufacturers reported a surge in demand for radio-friendly crunch. The BBC considered expanding the format to television, but Mr. Tuppence declined. Tea, he said, is best imagined. And then, in 1962, he retired. The final episode was quiet, heartfelt, and deeply British. He thanked his listeners. He described his favorite tea blend. He paused for one last kettle moment, and then, with a soft sigh, he said, "May your cups be warm, your biscuits intact, and your afternoons forever gentle." The nation mourned. Tributes poured in. A statue was erected in his honor, bronze, life-sized, holding a teacup. It stands in a park in Surrey, where birds perch on the rim and children ask, "Who's the man with the biscuit?" Today, the legacy of the afternoon hour lives on. In podcasts, in playlists, in quiet moments when the kettle whistles and the world slows down. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pause. So as you sit quietly, listening to the imagined clink of porcelain and the soft swirl of milk, let yourself drift, let the radio fade, let the tea steep, and let the gentle rhythm of Mr. Tuppence's voice guide you towards sleep. Because in a world of noise, sometimes all you need is a cup, a pause, and a story about sock elastic. Chapter 7. The office that scheduled meetings around biscuit availability. It was a Tuesday morning in 1974, and the office of Wadsworth and Plimpton, chartered accountants, was already in a mild state of panic, not because of a tax audit, not because of a missing ledger, but because the biscuit tin was empty. The tin, blue floral, slightly dented, usually sat beside the kettle in the break room. It was stocked every Monday by Mrs. Doreen Latchley, the firm's unofficial biscuit coordinator and full-time receptionist. Digestives, rich tea, custard creams, and on special occasions, shortbread fingers. But this week, due to a delivery mishap involving a confused grocer and a mislabeled crate of sardines, the biscuits had not arrived, and so the 10:30 meeting was postponed. This was not unusual at Wadsworth and Plimpton. Biscuit availability was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of scheduling. Meetings were timed to coincide with peak biscuit freshness. Monday mornings were ideal. The tin was full, the tea was strong, and the mood was cautiously optimistic. By Thursday afternoon, morale dipped, crumbs accumulated, and meetings were avoided unless absolutely necessary. The firm's internal calendar included biscuit annotations, Q2 review, digestives confirmed, client onboarding, custard creams pending, staff training, rich tea risk. These notes were taken seriously. One junior accountant once scheduled a performance review during a known biscuit drought and was gently advised to reschedule unless he fancied a mutiny. The biscuit-centric culture had evolved gradually. It began in the late 1960s, when Mr. Neville Wadsworth, co-founder and enthusiastic dunker, declared that no meeting should begin without a biscuit. He believed that a well-timed snack could soften criticism, encourage collaboration, and prevent the kind of passive-aggressive memo wars that had plagued the firm in its early years. His partner, Mr. Clive Plimpton, was initially skeptical, preferred coffee and considered biscuits a distraction. But after a particularly tense budget meeting was salvaged by a surprise appearance of Jammy Dodgers, he changed his mind. From that day forward, biscuits became policy. Mrs. Latchley took her role seriously. She tracked preferences, monitored consumption rates, and maintained a spreadsheet titled Biscuit Dynamics. She knew that Mr. Hargreaves preferred digestives, but would accept a hobnob in emergencies. She knew that Miss Penelope Smythe disliked chocolate coatings but adored lemon creams. She knew that the interns would eat anything, especially if it was free. Her system was precise. Biscuits were rotated weekly. Popular varieties were rationed to avoid early depletion. Experimental biscuits like fig rolls or coconut rings were introduced cautiously and only after staff surveys. The tin was cleaned every Friday, and the lid was polished with a cloth that smelled faintly of chamomile. Meetings were planned accordingly. Monday, strategy sessions featured neutral and unlikely to provoke strong emotions. Tuesday, client calls included rich tea, crisp, polite, and subtly impressive. Wednesday, brainstorming meetings were paired with custard cream, sweet, nostalgic, and conducive to creativity. Thursday, reviews were accompanied by ginger nut spicy, assertive, and ideal for confronting missed deadlines. Friday, wrap-ups were biscuit-free, as most staff had mentally checked out by noon. The system worked. Staff morale was high. Client satisfaction was steady. Productivity, while not dazzling, was consistent, and the biscuit tin became a symbol of the firm's quiet brilliance. But then came the crisis. On March of 1978, a new manager was hired, Mr. Quentin Blatherwick, a man with a fondness for efficiency and a deep mistrust of carbohydrates. On his first day, he noticed the biscuit annotations in the calendar and declared them frivolous. He proposed removing the tin, replacing it with a vending machine, and instituting a snack-neutral policy. The reaction was swift and silent. Staff began arriving late. Meetings grew tense. The tea grew bitter. Mrs. Latchley, heartbroken, took a brief leave of absence to visit her sister in Bournemouth. The vending machine, stocked with protein bars and dried fruit, was vandalized with a passive-aggressive note that read, "This is not a biscuit." Mr. Blatherwick held firm. He believed in progress. He believed in metrics. He believed that biscuits were holding the firm back. But after 3 months of declining morale, missed deadlines, and one particularly disastrous client meeting where a lack of shortbread led to a lost contract, he reconsidered. The tin was reinstated. Mrs. Latchley returned. The calendar was updated, and the firm slowly returned to its biscuit-based equilibrium. From then on, biscuit availability was treated with reverence. The staff were trained in biscuit etiquette. New hires received a welcome packet that included a biscuit preference survey. The annual retreat featured a biscuit and budget workshop where staff discussed financial goals while sampling new varieties. One year, the firm even hosted a biscuit summit. Representatives from other offices attended. Panels were held. Debates were staged. The keynote speaker, a retired biscuit designer, gave a moving speech titled "The Crumble That Changed My Life." It was followed by a standing ovation and a tea reception featuring 17 types of biscuit. Today, Wadsworth and Plimpton still schedules meetings around biscuit availability. The tin is larger. The selection is broader. Gluten-free options are included, but the spirit remains the same. Because in the end, a biscuit is more than a snack. It's a gesture, a ritual, a quiet promise that even in the world of spreadsheets and audits, there is room for comfort. So as you imagine the soft clink of a biscuit tin lid, the gentle rustle of wrappers, and the warm hum of a kettle nearby, let yourself drift, let the meeting wait, let the tea steep, and let the quiet dignity of a well-timed biscuit guide you toward sleep. Because sometimes, the best decisions are made not in boardrooms, but in break rooms with a cup in hand and a biscuit on the saucer. Chapter 8. The Unspoken Rules of Tea. Break etiquette. There are rules, and then there are tea break rules, not written down, not posted on walls, not enforced by managers or memos, but known deeply, instinctively, and universally by anyone who has ever paused at 3 p.m. with a cup in hand and a biscuit nearby. These are the unspoken rules of tea break etiquette, and they are sacred. Rule number 1. Never take the last biscuit unless you're absolutely certain everyone else has declined. This rule is older than most office buildings. The last biscuit is not just a snack, it's a symbol, a test of character, a social landmine. To take it without asking is to declare yourself a rogue, a biscuit bandit, a dunking disparator. The proper protocol is to hover near it, glance around, and say, "Anyone want the last one?" If no one responds within 3 seconds, you may proceed with caution. Rule number 2. Milk first or last is a matter of personal belief, not public debate. Some say milk first prevents scalding. Others say milk last allows proper steeping. Both camps are passionate. Both are wrong. The truth is, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you never correct someone else's method. To do so is to invite a passive-aggressive war of teaspoons. The polite response is to nod, sip, and silently judge. Rule number 3. Never stir someone else's tea, ever. This rule is absolute. Stirring is intimate. It's personal. It's sacred. To stir another's tea is to cross a boundary few recover from, even if the spoon is right there, even if they're busy, even if they say, "Could you stir that for me?" You must hesitate, make eye contact, and proceed only with solemnity. Rule number 4. The person closest to the kettle is not automatically responsible for making the tea. This is a common misconception. Proximity does not equal obligation. The true determinant is eye contact. If someone looks at you, raises an eyebrow and says, "Fancy a brew," you are now in a social contract. You must either make the tea or offer a compelling excuse, such as "I'm steeping emotionally" or "I've just washed my mug and it's drying spiritually." Rule number 5. Biscuit dunking is permitted, but splash damage is frowned upon. Dunking is an art, a science, a dance between texture and timing, but it must be done with grace. No crumbs on the table, no soggy remnants in the cup, and absolutely no biscuit collapse. If your biscuit breaks off mid-dunk and sinks, you must retrieve it discreetly or abandon the cup entirely. To drink it is to admit defeat. Rule number 6. Tea break conversation must remain within the bounds of gentle absurdity. Politics, no. Office gossip, maybe. The mating habits of hedgehogs. Perfect tea breaks are not for confrontation. They are for whimsy, mild complaints, and the occasional philosophical musing about whether biscuits have souls. The ideal tea break conversation includes at least one pun, one sigh, and one sentence that begins with "You know what I heard." Rule number 7. Mug envy is real, but must be managed with dignity. Everyone has a favorite mug. Some are chipped, Some are oversized, some feature cartoon owls wearing monocles. If someone brings a new mug to the break room, you may admire it, you may compliment it, but you must never touch it. Mug theft is the fastest way to become an office pariah. Respect the mug, honor the mug. Never microwave someone else's mug without written consent. Rule number 8. The tea maker is entitled to first sip. This is a matter of respect. They boiled the water. They measured the leaves. They stirred with care. To sip before them is to usurp their moment. Let them taste first. Let them nod in satisfaction. Then, and only then, may you proceed. Rule number 9. Silence is acceptable. Awkward silence is not. Tea breaks may be quiet, reflective, meditative, but if the silence becomes tensive, someone begins tapping their mug or sighing, theatrically it is your duty to break it. Offer a biscuit, make a pun, ask about their cat, restore the peace. Rule number 10. Never rush a tea break ever. Tea is not coffee. It is not gulped, it is not grabbed. It is sipped, savored, and respected. A proper tea break lasts at least 10 minutes. Anything less is a travesty. Anything more is a lifestyle. These rules are not enforced by law. They are not taught in schools, but they are known, passed down through generations, whispered in break rooms, honored in silence, and when followed, they create something magical, a moment of calm, a pause in the day, a shared ritual that says, we are here, we are human, we are mildly obsessed with biscuits. So as you imagine yourself in a quiet office, the kettle humming, the mug warm in your hands, let these rules guide you. Let the etiquette soothe you. Let the rhythm of the break lull you toward sleep, because in the end, tea break etiquette is not about rules, it's about respect, ritual, and the quiet joy of doing something slowly, properly, and with just the right amount of milk. Chapter 9. The forgotten tea break memo that changed office culture on time. Target: 12 to 15 minutes. Tone: dryly, amusing, nostalgic, quietly revelatory. Word count: approximately 1,500 words. Was a memo like any other, typed in Courier font, printed on beige paper, folded once, then twice, delivered to every desk in the Department of Administrative Affairs on a rainy Wednesday in 1982. It was titled, simply, Proposal for Standardized Midday Refreshment. Pause. No one paid much attention at first. The department, housed in a building that smelled faintly of damp carpet and unresolved paperwork, was not known for innovation. Its memos were frequent, its meetings eternal, and its coffee machine perpetually broken. The staff, mostly clerks, typists, and one man whose job title was staple coordinator, were used to ignoring memos unless they involved pay or biscuits, but this memo was different. It proposed a formal tea break, not just a casual pause, not just a whispered fancy a brew between filing cabinets, a scheduled, department-wide, officially sanctioned tea break, every day, at 11 a.m. with designated mugs, rotating biscuit duties, and a shared kettle log. The idea came from Miss Felicity Bramwell, a junior administrator with a fondness for structure and a deep respect for tea. She had noticed that productivity dipped mid-morning, that tempers frayed, that staplers were misfiring, and she believed, with quiet conviction, that tea could fix it. Her memo was precise. It outlined the benefits of a collective pause. It cited studies, real and imagined, about the restorative powers of steeped beverages. It included a proposed seating chart for the break room and a biscuit rotation schedule that accounted for dietary restrictions and emotional preferences. Did first. The response was tepid. Mr. Gribble, head of the department and a man who once described tea as a distraction with leaves, dismissed it as frivolous. Others were skeptical. What if the kettle explodes? Asked one clerk. What if someone brings garb? Asked another, visibly distressed. But Miss Bramwell persisted. She held informal tea trials. She brewed Earl Grey with precision. She offered digestives with quiet dignity. She created a spreadsheet titled Mood Improvement Metrics Post-Brew and distributed it with a smile. Slowly, the tide turned. The first official tea break took place on April 3, 1982. At 10:59 a.m., the department fell silent. At 11 a.m., mugs were lifted. Biscuits were passed. Conversations began, tentative, then warm. Someone complimented the kettle's whistle. Someone else shared a story about their cat's disdain for chamomile. It was, by all accounts, a success. Productivity rose. Complaints fell. The stapler coordinator smiled for the first time in 6 years. Word spread. Other departments took notice. The Department of Stationery adopted the practice, adding a biscuit suggestion box. The Department of Forms introduced themed tea days, mint Mondays, fennel Fridays. Even the Department of Redundancy department began hosting double brew Tuesdays, though no one was quite sure why. The memo, once forgotten, became legendary. It was framed and hung in the break room. It was quoted in staff meetings. It was referenced in the annual performance review as the most impactful document since the fire drill protocol. Miss Bramwell was promoted. The kettle was upgraded. The biscuit budget was increased. Tea break culture flourished. Staff began customizing their mugs. One clerk used a cup shaped like a hedgehog. Another had a mug that played God Save the Queen when lifted. Biscuit pairings became an art form. digestives with Darjeeling, shortbread with Assam custard creams with whatever was available. The break room evolved. It gained a bookshelf, a biscuit shelf, and a tea thoughts board where staff could post musings like is dunking a form of surrender, and if tea is steeped too long, does it become soup? The board was popular. The debates were civil. The tea was strong. Even management softened. Mr. Gribble, once a staunch opponent, began attending tea breaks. He brought his own mug, plain, chipped, and deeply sentimental. He never spoke much, but he always nodded at Miss Bramwell and took exactly 2 digestives. It was his way of saying thank you. The memo's influence extended beyond the office staff, began hosting TI-themed events, brew and budget workshops, steep and strategy sessions. One team even created a musical titled Kettle. The musical, featuring songs like Boil Me Gently and the Biscuit Waltz. It was performed once, to mild applause and several requests for more TI years passed. Staff retired, mugs were replaced, the kettle was upgraded again, but the tea break remained. It became tradition, ritual, a moment of calm in the bureaucratic storm. And the memo faded, framed, and slightly crooked remained on the wall, reminding everyone that sometimes the smallest ideas make the biggest difference. Today, the Department of Administrative Affairs still pauses at 11 a.m. The kettle whistles, the mugs clink, the biscuits crumble, and for 15 minutes, the world slows down. Conversations drift, laughter bubbles, and the quiet magic of tea does what it has always done: connect, comfort, and gently lull. So as you imagine the soft rustle of a memo, the hum of a kettle, and the warm weight of a mug in your hands, let yourself drift, let the break begin, let the tea steep, and let the forgotten memo guide you toward sleep, because in the end it's not just about tea, it's about the pause, the people, and the quiet brilliance of a well-timed biscuit. Chapter 10. The last tea break before the internet took over. It was a Thursday, the kind of Thursday that felt like a Wednesday pretending to be a Friday. The sky was indecisive, the office printer was jammed, and the Department of Administrative Affairs was preparing for its 4,382nd tea break. But this one would be different. Unbeknownst to the staff, who were currently debating whether fig rolls counted as biscuits, a seismic shift was brewing, not in the kettle, but in the world beyond. The break room, a shift that would change how people worked, talked, and even took their tea. The internet was coming. Not all at once, of course. It arrived in whispers, in floppy disks, in dial-up tones that sounded like a robot sneezing. But it was coming, and with it, the slow unraveling of the analog rituals that had defined office life for decades. The tea break was one of them. At 10:59 a.m., as always, the department paused. Mugs were lifted, biscuits were passed. Miss Bramwell, now senior coordinator of refreshment logistics, brewed a pot of Darjeeling with ceremonial grace. Mr. Gribble, retired but visiting, nodded solemnly and took his usual 2 digestives, but something was off. The break room had a new addition, a computer, beige, boxy, buzzing faintly. It had been installed the day before with great ceremony and mild confusion. No one was quite sure what it did. One clerk claimed it could send letters without stamps. Another said it could play chess with ghosts. It sat in the corner, blinking dot during the tea break. It was ignored mostly, a few glances, a few muttered comments. Looks like a toaster with ambition, someone said. I bet it doesn't even like tea, said someone else. The kettle whistled, the mugs clinked, the biscuits crumbled. But the computer watched on. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. Emails replaced memos. Meetings became virtual. The tea thoughts board was digitized, though no one knew how to access it. Staff began using phrases like ping me and circle back, which sounded suspiciously unteal-like. The break room felt different. The kettle still whistled. The mugs still clinked, but the conversations shifted. People talked about websites, about surfing without water, about cookies that weren't edible. The biscuit rotation schedule was uploaded to a shared drive, which promptly crashed. Miss Bramwell tried to adapt. She created a digital tea log. She hosted a webinar titled Steeped in Tradition, Navigating Refreshment in the Digital Age. She even attempted a virtual tea break, which involved staring at a webcam while sipping Earl Grey and pretending not to notice the lag. It wasn't the same. The warmth, the clink, the quiet camaraderie. It was harder to replicate through screens. Harder to feel when your tea break was interrupted by pop-ups and password resets. Harder to savor when your mug was replaced by a mouse. And so, on one quietly rebellious Thursday, the department decided to unplug. Just for 15 minutes at last 11 a.m. The computer was turned off. The printer was ignored. The emails were paused, and the tea break returned in filtered, unbuffered, gloriously analogued. Mugs were lifted, biscuits were passed. Someone brought fig rolls again, and the debate resumed. Mr. Gribble sent a postcard to commemorate the occasion. Miss Bramwell smiled and brewed Darjeeling with extra care. It was, by all accounts, perfect. The internet would continue. The screens would multiply. The digital tide would rise. But for those 15 minutes, the department remembered what mattered. The pause, the people, the kettle's whistle. And so, the last true tea break before the internet took over became legend. It was framed. It was blogged about ironically. It was referenced in a TED Talk titled Brewing Connection in a Digital World, and it reminded everyone that even in the age of Wi-Fi and cloud storage, there's still magic in a mug of biscuit and a well-timed pause. So as you drift into sleep, imagine the soft hum of a kettle, the gentle rustle of a biscuit wrapper, and the quiet rebellion of a department choosing tea over tech just for a moment, because sometimes the best way to connect is to disconnect.